We're going to start with you, Dr. Alexandra Bousiou from Greece and Sweden, I guess, now as well. And we will be discussing a little bit of your past work in the Greek islands, as well as a current project on integration in Sweden. What can be to our benefit here is that you have an inherently interdisciplinary approach, and that there's a trajectory perspective that you can provide that perhaps doesn't come out in people who focus on work in a specific context. So start perhaps by just telling us a little bit about the work you did in the Greek islands.
So I did my PhD work on the Greek islands that they're located just across Turkey. And these Greek islands are not just located across Turkey, they're also part of the European Union external border. For that reason, they have been chosen as key border spaces of managing asylum for the whole European Union, which put a lot of pressure in these locations and accumulated a lot of different actors, if we see it from a governance perspective, that were providing humanitarian services and humanitarian relief on the one hand, and trying to take care of the people arriving, mostly from Syria, and in higher numbers between the years of 2015 2016, but still now there are quite a lot of people trying to come as refugees, kind of like displaced due to conflict, through this specific route to the European Union. So the specificity, I think, is that these people come and they encounter the European for the first time on these islands just across Turkey, and they encountered a very diverse set of actors that they're dealing with different kinds of needs. And overall, we have to say that the conditions they're facing are horrendous, and there have been horrendous throughout these years, different kinds of horrendous, if I may say so. So the living conditions in relation to hygiene, if we want to, of course, to tie back to health and well-being, in relation to hygiene, in relation to like housing is probably an overstatement. We're talking about camp situations. The restriction movement have been intensified. The thing is that people cross from there, but in most cases, their ultimate goal or ultimate idea is that they will manage to go somewhere in the West Northern Europe. The idea for most of these people is that they will rejoin their families or friends or other social networks in one of the countries in the north of Europe, where they have better possibilities to find a job, and they have better possibilities to be part of some sort of welfare provisions that they will allow them to integrate. And I say to integrate with like not a pinch of salt, but like a kilo of salt at least. So what I found fascinating when I thought that, okay, after finishing this very heavy work at the borders and kind of like try to understand this complex governance situation, and how are these people treated, how the different actors perceive themselves, and how they work together or against each other in basically trying to carry the load of being the gatekeepers for the whole of the European Union into working with housing in Sweden. I thought I would be doing something different. And then, of course, I realized that it's exactly the same thing, because it's these people, basically all of the people I have encountered so far after 1 year of empirical work on this new project on housing in Sweden, all of them have passed through this border point. So it becomes extremely fascinating to think that how first of all, the people migrating for reason of escaping conflict, for reason of escaping extreme poverty, for whatever reason, they're putting themselves into this extremely dangerous and painful journey. It's not really like going on a charter journey. How basically they change hats the whole time. They are the bogus migrant, and then they apply for asylum, and they're the asylum seeker, and then maybe they're granted the refugee status or not, and they continue moving through the European Union, trying to escape the authorities, so they will not be returned under Dublin regulation. They might manage to arrive, for example, in Sweden, in the case that I'm studying, and then they try to be part of that system. They apply again, maybe for asylum. They get the refugee status. They get a residence permit, and they have to find their way into the Swedish society. And it's these same people. And I think that it is very important to think about that when we're discussing about integration, belonging. To go on the other end of the story, in Sweden we have a huge lack of housing, and social housing rentals through the social housing is in the big cities takes so many years before you can access them. Like I would say that for Malmö, Gothenburg, and Stockholm, the three bigger cities, you need close to a decade to have access to okay priced, longer term type of housing. If you think about this person that has left, let's say, their place in Syria and traveled through Turkey, went through the Greek borders, finally arrived in Sweden, we're talking about maybe having a possibility to have a more stable living situation, which for me is kind of like the bare minimum basis of discussing any kind of well-being. In maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And I think this is very telling of how impossible any integration policies or any idea of having of people being able to have well-being and belonging and building their lives, regardless of what their paper says. If it says that you have like, oh, I have a permanent residence permit now in Sweden, the fact that you cannot really partake in any way, not in any way in an equal footstep in the society from the very basic thing of where can you live and how, I think is very much worth discussing and worth problematizing when there is a study of policy coming from kind of like from the top that says that, oh, Sweden is failing in integration, and why do we have problems with segregation if we think that they cannot really establish their lives, if they can't really have this first basic step of having a more stable home. I think that any other discussions of success or failure are very much detached from the living reality.
I'm thinking civil society actors, personal relationships, social relationships, people finding creative solutions to addressing these problems in everyday life, waiting for a governance integration perspective to kick in. What do people do in the meantime? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
I think that this is really important, and I think that it is very important also to see it, especially for the case of Greece, as also a constant struggle. So back in 2015-2016, the state was very happy to welcome all of these humanitarian actors and the civil society, basically handing in all the work to be done with the needs of the people to them. And then we have seen slowly but steadily the exclusion of these actors. I think that this is very much telling of how the securitization of migration, and especially what has been happening in relation with the common European asylum system and the way that it tries to be as restrictive as possible while keeping the face of Europe of the human rights, what it has been doing to the civil society, and also to these priorities that the civil society has in relation to, as you say, like having more of a holistic and long-term engagement into building the bonds, into building the trust with the people working with migrants and refugees. And when we're talking about Sweden, then we have a really impressive case study that we're studying in Helsingborg, where we have a housing project that is for Swedish people, or Swedish-born people as it categorizes in Sweden, over 70 years old, and Swedish-born youth between 18-25, and foreign-born youth, which is usually refugee youth between 18 and 25. And this idea of like social engineering, we have so much of that in Scandinavia, of bringing together these different groups actually is in fantastic integration results, or I would rather say social inclusion. I think it is a way better way of describing it. And for instance, an example now with the pandemic, there was one person living there that got really depressed, and because of this social structure and the encounters, the other people living in this kind of like cooperative housing project were able to see that and to offer some sort of help and to say like, hey, we're here, we can help you out, we can point you to the different kind of like help you can find in the health system, but most importantly, we're here for you, which is extremely important. So I would like to say that yes, different kinds of actors, and especially actors that work within this idea of the social inclusion and of bringing people together and creating these bridges, are quintessential and very much contested from the state and the government, and kind of like pulled in to do the work when they're needed, and then pushed out the moment that other security related priorities emerge.
For those who are listening who are not familiar with the Swedish context, showing up for your neighbor or being social in a broader sense in a community is not entirely a Swedish way of being. Where it is very much that you can live in a neighborhood or in an apartment building and absolutely never ever know anyone else that lives in the same building as you. So I'm wondering, because what you said here is that living in this housing project situation, that a community looked out for itself. They looked out for each other, and that perhaps is the goal. But what we're talking about here is also the existential human experience of belonging, of being part of a community, of being able to turn to somebody who will be there for help.
When it comes to social engineering, I think exactly because in Sweden none of that is taken for granted. There need to be these key people, these key bureaucrats, these people in these positions where they actually have a vision. You need some visionaries that will go there and push and present and kind of like work for this idea of, and it doesn't kind of like happen kind of, as you say, it will not happen in your average Swedish neighborhood. What is a very positive surprise for me is that when actually there is this visionary architect that kind of like manages to get through the very, very inflexible bureaucracy, we have to say, this kind of an idea, you see that kind of like the social matrix is really kind of like taking it in and working with it, which I think tells a lot. Like, it was so interesting to interview in a lot of these people over 70 Swedish born people, that they were like, oh, we were skeptical about living with young people because, I mean, what if they were very noisy and partying all the time? But at the same time, we were compelled by this idea. And it worked out so much better than we thought. And it's so interesting to meet them and talk with them. And like, we found we have so much in common, like the different kinds of groups they have, in the gardening group. The whole housing complex is in a very green, beautiful, lush area. And they have a lot of green space that they can do whatever they want to with. What does that bring? Kind of like beyond your nationality and ethnicity and your age. And I think that also thinking about inclusion and exclusion more, and I think this is so important when this kind of thought starts to come to the policymakers or the implementers of the policies, this idea of integration, or rather inclusion, has to do with different kinds of divides existing in the society that is beyond Swedishness, or Swedish and refugee, or migrant, or undocumented migrant, or like all these legal hats that one can wear. And it has to do, for instance, with age, it has to do with race, it has to do with gender, it has to do with these type of things, and there are different groups that they're more included or excluded in a society, even if we're talking about a society with the welfare and kind of like the democratic tradition, etc., like the Swedish society. So if we start to think a bit more along these lines, I think that different initiatives and policies have way bigger chances of succeeding and of kind of like bringing this positive change in people's life. Because for me, to discuss success or failure is not necessarily the fact that like, oh, and now you have a job and we don't have to pay you the unemployment allowance and you're off our little kind of like notebook with expenses. It's more about like providing with people the chance of having a fulfilling life. Like, and where does something that a colleague of mine kind of like brings back, and I think it's super important, is like, when do you stop to be a migrant, especially in Sweden, that kind of like you get the citizenship eventually, you get a residence permit, and then you get the citizenship, and then your kids or your grandkids are still kind of like, when do you stop categorize as migrant or of migrant background, and kind of like when does the society accept you as an equal?
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and I look forward to our continued conversation
Yes.
on this matter. And thank you for sharing your work, and we'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.